In this presentation, I want to talk to you a little bit about the customer satisfaction survey, or survey score, I guess, in CapSim. For starters, okay, I'm going to refer to that throughout as the CSS, for short, customer survey score. But probably what you mainly need to know about this, it's one of the most important, and I would say most overlooked and least understood items on the Capstone Courier. So we're going to talk about where it is, what does it reflect, how does CapSim use it, how is it calculated, and why you should care. So where is it? If you were to look on the Capstone Courier segment analysis in the far right area of the product data reports, you would see it in the far right, okay? And it's just a number, and you can think of it as a percentage. That score, which, by the way, that score is as of the end of December of the last round, what you can imagine is that it is a single number that tries to synthesize or combine all of the CapSim market research for each product in a customer segment into a single number that reflects how well the customer likes the product. So imagine that you had gone out and done surveys of 100% of the customers in a segment each month. And in a particular month, you ask the customers to rank your product on a scale from 0 to 100, 100 being best. The survey is intending to reflect what the customer's average result for you might have been. So for example, if you go back and look at the prior example, it's a little bit hard to see, but there's some 27s up there, there's a 17. So 27 would say that on average they gave you a rank of 27 out of 100. That's not a particularly good score compared to 100, but it is the best score out there. So what does CapSim do with it? Quite literally, CapSim basically takes your customer survey score, your CSS for a particular product. In each month, it calculates a new one. You only see the one for December, but it actually does it every month. So they calculate yours, they calculate the scores for all the other products that fall inside of the rough cut for the particular customer segment. They sum all of those together, and then they take your score and divide it into that total, and that becomes your potential market share. And so I've put together a little example of how that might work. Let me see if I can find that, sorry. There we go. And so here's an example. I guess that's a little bit small. Let me see if I can make it just a little bit larger. Okay, here's an example where I literally just cut and pasted this stuff from a courier in every row and every column out to here. And you can see for this particular example, as of December 31st, these were the scores. So you had a lot of 18s and some 4s. These are all similar primarily because I used a round 1, and so everybody's kind of in the same place. But if you were to sum all of these up, they add up to 132. If you take 18, divide it by 132, you get 13.66. And so that is your December score. Now, your December score may not necessarily match your market share. Remember, this is just your score as of the end of December. Your market share is the percent of what you actually sold throughout the year. And so those can vary for some reasons. One of those reasons is that you may have, again, throughout the year, you may have not been in the same spot as you were on December 31st. Remember that while you are locking in, for example, your size and your position, you're doing that on a particular date with your R&D. Prior to that date, the product is, for each month prior to that, it just counts as being at whatever its prior spec was. And so your actual spec changes throughout the year. Now your price doesn't change, your MTBF doesn't change. That's all set at the beginning of the year. Your age does change; it increases throughout, and of course, if you release R&D, that cuts the age in half, and you start again. So those two things, your position and your age of your product, actually change from month to month. At the same time, the ideal spot changes from month to month, and so there's enough dynamic in there that it would be really impossible. Well, it is technically impossible that your product would be in the perfect position for 12 months in a row. Simply not possible. And so, as a result of that, you may have positioned your product so that it's perfect by the end of the year, but it was, by definition, then less than perfect for some of the year, and so your results would not be the same. In addition to that, your market share reflects how much you actually sold, whereas the calculation that I'm talking about using the customer survey score calculates what your potential market sales are. And so when you go look on the marketing report or look in your segment reports and see this notion of a potential market share, that is CapSim basically saying, having aggregated all of the share that you could have sold each month over the course of the year and averaging that out, that would have been how much you would have sold for the whole year if you'd had enough product to sell in those months. And so again, the idea there is that the actual market share could be different from what you calculate here, partly because you can only see 1 month's worth of it, you can't see all of it for every period, but also because you have to actually have it to sell in order for it to go into market share, whereas this reflects what you could sell. So, how is it calculated? This is really tricky. I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know exactly how it's calculated. In fact, CapSim does a pretty good job of keeping that information hidden. That's sort of the secret sauce of their system, and so it's a trade secret, and they don't want to just put it out in a book. But what I can tell you is that it's really broken down into two components. Think of it in terms of a base score, which is a score that's awarded to you based on how you do on the 4 buyer criteria, so price, positioning, reliability, and age. And then there's a second component that we'll talk about here in just a minute that is an adjustment to that base score. So in the base score, let's just say that if your product attributes were to perfectly match all the buyer criteria, so you had the perfect price, which would be the lowest price in the range, highest MTBF, your specs were right on the ideal spot, and you were at exactly the ideal age, then you would receive a base score of 100. Now, I say that, I will be honest with you, in some of the work that I've been doing, I have seen scores that are higher than 100 in the customer survey scores. And so I don't know whether that's because of the base or because of one of the adjustment factors, what's going on there. But the bottom line is that I have seen scores over 100, 101, 102, 103, that sort of thing. So it's quite possible that you could get more than 100. Now, so let's say that if it was perfect, you start at 100. The less perfect it is, you start losing points off of your base score the further your product attributes are from the buyer criteria. The number of points you lose for not matching a given criterion is greater for the higher weighted criteria than for the lower weighted criteria. Now, exactly how that works is, again, a trade secret and something that's a little bit hard to figure out. But suffice it to say that inside of the 4 customer criteria, if you think in terms of being as close as possible to the buyer criteria, the best buyer criteria for the more highly weighted items, then you can do better on your score. Ideally, being closer on all of them would put you in the best possible situation. Now, that said, you could be great on, let's say, 3 of the buyer criteria, but be in the rough cut on one of them, and that's enough to basically start cutting your base score proportionately for how far outside the fine cut and into the rough cut you are. So let's just say that because of 3 different criteria of the 4 criteria, you had a base score of 60, or let's just say 80. And then you turn around and you have, something, maybe it's your price, I don't know, but let's just say that your price is out in the rough cut. You're $4 below the fine cut range, and so you're 80% out into that. And so what it's basically going to do is take that 80 and say, okay, 100 minus the 80% that you're out into this, and I forget, what did we say our score? Well, let's just say our score was 100. That'll be easy. So our base score was 100 other than this one attribute. And this one attribute, you're 80% of the way out into the rough cut. It's going to reduce your score from 100 to 20. So 100% minus the 80% that you are away gives you a 20% rating. 20% times your 100 score, you only get 20 points. If you'd started with a base score of, say, 60, you're only going to get 12, 20% to 60. So being in the rough cut can really hurt you. If you're in the rough cut on more than one attribute, then CapSim, it looks like, takes the one that you're the furthest in the rough cut, and that's the one it uses for the adjustment. So you need to pay attention to that. And if you're outside the rough cut on any criteria, you go to a score of 0, period, no discussions. So you can be perfect on 3 criteria, but in the rough cut, outside the rough cut on 1, you'll get a score of 0. What about the other component? The other component is based on customer awareness, customer accessibility, and days in accounts receivable. And that one, I've been able to sort of reverse engineer, and so I've given you formulas here. Think of it, if I have a customer awareness score of, say, 80, then the adjustment factor is equal to 50% plus half of 80. So 50% plus 40, you'd get a adjustment factor of 90% there. Okay, let's say your customer accessibility is 50%, then the factor would be 40% plus 0.6 times 50%. 0.6 times 50% is 30, plus 40 is 70. You'd get an adjustment factor of 70. Just using that as an example. Days of AR, the formula is a little bit more complex than that, but I can tell you kind of the breakdowns that are in the team guide. If you have a days in accounts receivable of more than 90 days, then you get a factor of 100, and higher factors are good here. If it's 60 days, then it reduces it by 0.7, so it's not 99.7, it's actually going to be 99.3. I'll fix that in the PowerPoint. At 30 days, it's 93. If you have 0 days in AR, meaning my policy is everybody pays cash, then you're basically going to be reduced by 40%. You're only going to get 60% of whatever the base score is. Now that's just the beginning. Then CapSim takes each of those 3 percentages and multiplies them all together. And so you could be really good on one of these, but if you're bad on one of the other ones, then it takes everything down. And that becomes the single factor that you multiply by your base score. So again, if we go back to previously and say, let's say we had a great base score, and it was maybe 80 points, I don't know. If you don't do well on this and this factor winds up being like a 40, you're talking about taking 80 points times 40%, 32 points. You went from 80 points to 32 points just because of these factors. So they are a big deal. They can be considered in a lot of respects every much as big deal in terms of helping you compete as any of the individual criteria. So let's just use an example. Remember, a perfect base score is 100 points. So we're going to look at a low-end product just as an example. And let's say your price is $2 higher than the minimum. And because price is an important thing for the low end, you're going to lose a lot for that. So you may lose 20 of your points for just being $2 off from the minimum. So you went from 100 down to 80 just because of that. And then your of course, the age, it wants 7 years in the low end. you've only got a age of 5 years, you might lose 10 points for that. Age is an important criteria, but quite frankly, the way that CapSim looks at it, for the low end, that's just not as big a deal. I would encourage you, both price and age and MTBF and to some extent positioning. The team member guide gives you some graphics that give you some idea of how far out you are and how extreme that affects your points and so forth. Again, it's not a formula, but it can give you some insight into this. So let's say we went from 100 points down to 80, and then because of age we went down to 70. And then my product is a half a unit from the ideal spot. I might lose, let's just say 10 points for that because positioning's not that important. So I'm down from 100 to 60 points. My MTBF is perfect, so I don't lose any points on that. Perfect being it's at the highest MTBF. Not sure I would have chosen to do that for the low end, but let's say that I did. Then I'm down to 60 points as a base score. Now let's go look and see how the other adjustment factors work. I've been doing a good job on my customer awareness. I got it up to about 90%, so I get a 95% factor. Customer accessibility, I didn't want to spend as much money on that, so it's only up to 70%. I get an 82% factor. Days in AR, I've got it 30 days, so I've lost 7% because of that. I'm at 93%. I multiply all those together, comes out to 72.5%. This is a big one for you guys to understand. When you multiply them, by definition, the result is going to be less than any of them, right? Unless they're all at 100%. And so you're sort of making it worse and worse when you compound factors on top of each other. So now you're talking about that you started with a 60, you're going to multiply it by 72.5%, you're going to wind up with a 43.5, probably get rounded either a 43 or a 44, don't know what rounding they do. So you started with a possible 100, you made a few things go away on the base score, that cost you 40 points, and then this adjustment factor cost you another 16 points. Next thing you know, you're below a 50. So why do I care about this? I want to sort of link this to the real world. This isn't just a CapSim thing. Understand, CapSim doesn't reveal the formulas they use for the customer survey scores. Totally understand why, that's their trade secret. But in the real world, as an executive, you would have paid for marketing research to basically understand if we change our product attributes or our sales or promotion or accounts receivable in particular ways, how are customers likely to react to that? And so we would have the ability, without actually going and changing them, to get some indication of that by surveys and focus groups and so forth. And so this is, this is one of those instances where I don't think that CapSim does as good a job of mimicking the real world as it could. This is a vital piece of information. The question of when I make changes, how is that likely to affect the way that customers receive them? That is something that companies spend a lot of money to find out, and we don't have a way of predicting that in advance here. And so that is a gap, and I am working to fill that gap. I've been playing around with trying to get a tool that will do a reasonable job of approximating what's in CapSim. Again, I'm not trying to reverse engineer their product or make public any of the formulas that they use. But as soon as I have that to the point that I think that it is in a close enough ballpark that it will give you good, useful intuition about the trade-offs between the decisions that you make, I'll make that available to you. Unfortunately, it's just not there right now, and it is a very time-consuming thing to try and get it there. And so the best I can say for you at this point is you can go ahead and rely on the formulas that I gave you for the adjustment factors, but for the 4 criteria, you should really go back, look at the team member guide, see how it discusses how each of those goes into the customer satisfaction survey and impacts it, and start to develop your own intuition on that. And similarly, you can develop some intuition by making different decisions during the practice rounds and seeing influences the customer satisfaction score. I would definitely encourage you to start paying attention to that score round around and seeing how the decisions that you're making are influencing that score and how they are comparing to those of others. Anyway, I hope this is useful. Again, in my view, I think of success in CapSim, success in the real world as basically being, on the one hand, we do need to do things that keep our customers happy and attract as many of them as we reasonably can. On the other hand, we need to make sure that we're generating a profit, which is really becomes defined by the price versus the cost. And so you sort of have this triangle, if you will, where if I move the price, that's going to affect the customer demand. If I move the costs, that's going to change I do that by changing the attributes of the product. That's going to affect the customer demand. And of course, the combination of what happens between the price and the cost becomes my profit, and that also matters. But it's price minus that difference times number of units sold, which is the customer demand. And so, at the end of the day, this is an accurate reflection of the balancing act that executives are doing with their products all the time, trying to find that sweet spot, if you will, where they can get a good per unit return in terms of profit margins, while not harming their demand so much that they give up all of that value by losing the demand. So anyway, I hope this is helpful for you. I guess you'll give me feedback on that. Thank you, guys.